Earlier in the series, in episode 4, The Cosmic Bloodstream, the divine circulatory system of space was considered. And in the last episode, Building the Carbon Temple, we explored the palace of living fire that the Solar Logos is constructing through its medium. And in this episode, these two subjects can now be considered a little closer in terms of the creative process at work in the macrocosm and the microcosm. As we have seen, there are 6 forces in nature and a synthesizing all force symbolized by the hexagon, formed of 6 triangles whose apices converge to a point. These forces of universal creation are also depicted in the flower of life, a figure in sacred geometry composed of evenly spaced overlapping circles arranged to form a flower-like pattern. From the center of each flower emanates 6 petals, representing the 6 forces in nature, each extending to the perimeter of the circle that encloses them, the synthesizing all force. The center of each flower is on the circumference of the 6 others, depicting perfect form, proportion, and harmony. The flower of life represents the fundamental generative forces in time and space working out as right relationships between all things. Considered from the perspective of the 7 rays of life, the synthesizing all force is the second ray, or the ray of love wisdom, as it guides and spirals the other 6 forces in their form-building activities. On the physical plane, this is especially in conjunction with the electrical coordinating force of the 7th ray, or the ray of ceremonial order and organization. These 2 rays can be seen at work in the shape of gigantic electrified double helixes that proliferate throughout the cosmos, supplying the power that generates and forms galaxies, stars, and planets, like we learned in episode 3. The topic of the 7 rays is an immense subject unto itself and will be explored in more detail in the next episodes.
And once again, it's time to cross the electric bridge.
Let's now turn our attention over to some of the magnificent electrical structures found in space. Birkeland currents. This image displays the divine qualities of living substance pinching down through the generative regions to form galaxies, stars, and planets. As parallel Birkeland current filaments are drawn together, they begin to rotate in pairs, forming braided helical filaments. When viewed down the axis of these rotating filaments, a cylindrical ring can be seen, wherein tremendous electric tension is generated that breaks up into vortices, known as dichotron instabilities, with a preferred hexagonal shape. Dichotron instabilities have been known since the turn of the 19th century, when Christian Birkeland first photographed particle beams passing through a low vacuum. It provides a more likely explanation than fluid dynamics for the hexagonal patterns that exist at Saturn's North Pole, as these geometrical patterns are also seen on rocky moons and planets, as well as the North Pole of this gas giant. Throughout our solar system, heavily cratered planets and moons show these other features that can also be replicated in the laboratory by the use of electric discharging with machining used in industrial applications, but are difficult to explain elsewhere in the universe unless electricity is actively present everywhere. To date, the formation of hexagonal phenomena in the cosmos through electric tension and its subsequent discharge is not yet acknowledged in standard astrophysics. However, the evidence is steadily accruing, and at some point, the Big Bang gravitational model of the cosmos will require a major rethink, along with its associated theories of general relativity, black holes, dark matter, and dark energy. These essentials of the current gravitational model are not required in an electric universe. It is electric tension in the cosmic bloodstream of space that produces all manner phenomena in the heavens, based on the hexagonal geometry of the flower of life. Current research is showing that this process is also at work in water, whose surface is electrically organized into a hexagonal structure that carries information to that which it surrounds, including DNA and all other protein chains that construct all life forms on Earth. This will be explored in more depth later on. Next, we will examine how the mammalian brain functions through a fractal-like structure of hexagons at many different levels, and how this arrangement translates thought forms into electrical signals in the cerebral cortex. Having presented an overview of electric tension and sacred space, this needs to be linked to the other themes of the electric bridge, first and foremost, the cosmic bloodstream. Here, correspondences were drawn between the interstellar ether and water, noting that the ether is water in its most primordial state. And in both cases, electromagnetic tension is at play based on the sacred geometry of the hexagon. The human body is around 2/3 water by volume, as water makes up 90% of the blood plasma, as well as surrounding all the DNA and protein chains in the body. Water is the foundation of the human organism. In fact, the water molecule accounts for 99% of all molecules in the human body. It is also interesting to note that the Earth's surface is primarily water. In the dictionary of the sacred language of all scriptures and myths, there is a symbol called the robe of waters that represents the vesture of wisdom enwrapping the liberated self. The self is seen to be as a center wherein all the rays of the divine life are focused into one supernal light, and about the divine nature is the garment of truth represented by water. As well as being a beautiful image, this symbol also conveys the reality that while the life of an organism is found at the center of the form, on the outside is a garment of truth, a robe of ether that builds, sustains, and informs the manifestation in conformity with its part in the evolutionary process or the divine plan. This robe is made of two fabrics, ether and water, the former interpenetrating the latter, which then supplies information to all cells in the body. Many cutting-edge scientists are making profound discoveries, even though they are not necessarily attempting to prove the existence of the ether. That said, their research is still leading in that direction, whether they know it or not. The research of Gerald Pollack, professor of bioengineering at Washington University, is instrumental in showing how this is so. He and his research team have conducted many experiments on water in order to investigate its high surface tension. Originally, it was thought that there were a couple of molecule levels of static charge at water's surface, But this has seemed insufficient to create such surface tensions that artifacts such as a heavy coin can be floated upon it, or creatures such as the aptly named Jesus lizard can walk across it, albeit rather quickly. However, experiments have now shown that at its surface, water assumes a fourth state. While the other states are the familiar ice, liquid, and vapor, this fourth state has the quality of a liquid crystal. It is a gel-like structure and not just a couple molecule layers thick, but something far more extensive in the order of 2 or 3 million layers. This water is a viscous substance that has an ordered structure and carries a negative electrical charge. Its energy and ordering capacity comes from various light sources, such as the sun and the infrared light that is all around us. But what is most interesting is that this water absorbs light at 270 nanometers. This wavelength is the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. Ultraviolet light being the bridge of communication between the visible light and the invisible light of the etheric levels of the physical plane, out of which the energy bodies of all living things are formed and constructed. Information from the etheric body is transmitted through a bridge of ultraviolet light straight into the water that surrounds every cell in the physical body. And it is here that the true source of information behind the genetic code, like DNA, is likely to be found. The way that water holds this information is through a state of electrical tension based on the geometry of the hexagon, and because this fourth state of water is a liquid crystal, it acts as a semiconductor. It can hold information in its hexagonal ring-like structures, such structures being known to be associated with the absorption of ultraviolet light at around, you guessed it, 270 nanometers. Jared Pollock discovered that this fourth state of water is formed out of these sheets of hexagons layered on top of one another like a honeycomb. Furthermore, the angle of each sheet shifts 60 degrees, and as the layers of the hexagon stack up, they create a helical structure, forming a perfect robe that surrounds each molecule of DNA and RNA in the body. It is here that the secret of the memory of water that has intrigued recent investigators such as Jacques Benaveste is to be found, as well as the transfer of thought energy to water as demonstrated in the experiments by the late Dr. Emoto. Thought energy precipitating through the ethers would naturally continue on down into water. For as we have discussed elsewhere in the Electric Bridge series, when you look at water, that transparent, tasteless, odorless, adaptable fluid with all its remarkable qualities, you are looking directly at the ether in its densest form. Because water makes up nearly 90% of blood plasma, and much of it is in this fourth phase of an electrically charged liquid crystal, we may find some scientific evidence here that is electric action, which is chiefly responsible for the blood circulation rather than just the heart alone. The heart is not a pump forcing inert blood to move with pressure, but the blood is propelled with its own biological momentum and boosts itself with the induced momenta from the heart. Way back in 1932, Bremer of Harvard filmed the blood circulating in spiral streams in a very young embryo before the heart was even functioning. However, he was so impressed with the spiraling blood flow pattern that he ignored the larger implications, that the blood has its own inherent momentum, the heart serving to boost this with spiraling impulses. Jared Pollack's research suggests that infrared energy radiating into the bloodstream from the environment helps to drive the bloodstream, and this research is moving in the right direction. Although, in view of the esoteric sciences, the energy source is mainly from etheric levels. Before moving on, let's quickly recapitulate what we have discussed here. So far, we have explored the premise that the building force at work in the cosmos is not primarily gravity as thought by standard cosmology, but electric tension based on the sacred geometry of the hexagon. We have also examined this phenomena at work in the growth, development, and functioning of living organisms through the water that surrounds DNA and all protein chains. We can now move on to explore how electric tension and the sacred geometry of the hexagon are at work in consciousness itself. Amazingly, cognitive neuroscience within academia regards consciousness as essentially a mechanical illusion. This view has arisen from experiments showing that the brain takes several hundred milliseconds to process and translate a sensory input. Consequentially, in conversations between two people, each person generally responds to what the other has said before the brain activity that correlates with processing speech has even transpired. The conclusion is that dialogue takes place unconsciously. Human beings respond to one another before their brains have processed what has been said, and are therefore just under the illusion that they are in conscious control after the event. And so consciousness is viewed as epiphenomenal, a dream state in the effervescence rising from particles of matter in motion. This is the materialistic, reductionist viewpoint by most scientists. Now, to explore this enigma of the mind-body connection correctly, we need proper discernment between truth, partial truth, and falsehood. Consciousness does indeed rise up out of particles of matter in motion when they reach a certain level of complex organization. However, the life force behind consciousness is not spontaneously generated at this point, for all matter is thrilling with life and already has consciousness latent within it. The reality is that it's only at a certain stage of complexity that this becomes recognizable to human perception and can then be examined with a scientific method. So it's really our definition of life itself that needs to be expanded on. But aside from this, a good bridge between the material and spiritual perspectives can be found in the thinking of Bertrand Russell, a great agnostic philosopher who proposed that consciousness exists not in physical space, but in non-physical perceptual space. To illustrate the thinking behind Russell's idea, a classic example involves looking at your finger. When the image of the finger falls onto the retina, it is immediately digitized into a stream of electric impulses that race through the pitch-black interiors of the nerve fibers into the brain. But somehow, the image then magically reappears in the brain as a virtual object, and furthermore gives rise to the illusion that is not in our brain, but outside of our head. Our brain has performed a biopsy of the light reflected from our finger and projected it back at the source. The big question then is, where is reality? Inside our brain or outside of the head where it appears to be? Those who follow Bertrand Russell's reasoning would say neither. The dynamics of consciousness occur in a different kind of space, parallel to the objective physical space of function. This is taken further by Dr. Peter Whaling, a clinical anesthesiologist at Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas, who has been researching the dynamics of consciousness. He does this by examining the fluctuations in the electrical current flows within the brain cells and transposing the data into geometrical representation of their changing dynamics. Out of the seeming chaos of brainwave activity, he found an ordered geometry subtly operating behind the workings of consciousness. It was also discovered that certain patterns reoccurred and were tending towards specific geometrical archetypes known in the mathematics of chaos theory as fractal attractors. These findings suggest that consciousness is functioning and evolving in an abstract mathematical dimension. Dr. Whaling believes that as sensory impressions from the outside world reach the brain in the form of electrical signals, the brain transfers them into a higher dimensional structure in non-physical space. And the geometry of this space is the basis of conscious thought. A vital part of this theory rests on what is known as gamma wave synchrony within the brain. Neuroscientists generally agree that this measurement of coordinated electrical activity best represents consciousness. Gamma wave synchrony occurs when the frequency of neural firing reaches 40 to 100 Hz in an orchestrated fashion all over the brain. All the different data coming into the brain being brought into synchronous activity. Research on patients coming out of anesthesia corroborates this, as the regaining of consciousness is matched by a gamma wave ascent that eventually reaches the point where coherent thought is possible again. Further research shows that the more a subject is able to concentrate their thinking, the more gamma wave synchrony is present in the electrical activity of the brain. Researchers at the University of Madison, Wisconsin have found that during meditation, Zen Buddhist monks show an extraordinary synchronization of brain waves at this frequency. They said, while meditating, the monks produced gamma waves that were extremely high in amplitude and had long-range gamma synchrony. The waves from disparate brain regions were near lockstep, like numerous skipping ropes turning precisely together. They show that spiritual harmony requires coordination of otherwise scattered groups of neurons. Dr. Whaling's study of the dynamics of gamma wave synchrony has only recently become possible due to the power of computer-enhanced data. And so the challenge is now to see how the geometry of consciousness in perceptual space relates to the geometry of the brain in objective space. And a good place to start is with what they both have in common, their fractal geometry. A fractal is a geometrical pattern that is repeated at an ever-decreasing scale to produce irregular shapes and surfaces that don't occur in classical geometry. This property of fractals is known as self-similarity. A good everyday example is a tree. A tree grows by repeating the simple process of branching, which means that a little piece of the tree, like a twig, has the same general shape as a bigger part, such as the branch, which in turn is similar in structure to the entire tree. Scientific investigation has shown that the brain cortex is fractal in nature. That is, smaller structures within it exhibit the same general pattern as the cortex itself over all spatial scales. As Dr. Whaling has discovered, the dynamics of consciousness are also fractal in nature. So clearly the crossover point between the realms of consciousness and matter relies on fractal geometry of some kind. Consciousness requires sympathetically shaped receiving or docking stations in matter that can receive its communications and send objective information back to it. And this communication exchange occurs through specific fractal patterns based on, you guessed it, hexagons. The first hexagonal pattern is in the part of the brain that is responsible for memory and navigation, the entorhinal cortex. Both animals and human beings have the hexagonal spatial representation of the surrounding environment. This is in harmony with the esoteric perspective, as the number 6 is associated with form and manifestation. The same hexagonal patterns are also discovered at deeper levels within the entorhinal cortex, but at much finer scales. The interior of brain cells have a structure known as microtubules that are cylindrical in shape with a hexagonal lattice on their surface. This hexagonal surface is perfectly suited to the flurries of tiny snowflake-shaped enzymes that are attracted to them by electrostatic affinity. These biological catalysts are hollow double hexagons known as CA-MK2. To the esotericist, it is their hollow nature that is interesting to point out, as this always signifies a crossover zone between the inner and outer planes. The hexagonal vortices that each of these protein frames is likely to hold the secret of how information transfers between consciousness and the physical brain. As these little proteins that land upon the microtubule surface, they extend 6 legs like tiny landing craft, each foot acting like a bit of information, the 6 bits making 1 byte. Through this interaction, dynamic patterns are formed on the hexagonal lattice of the microtubules, and some insightful researchers think that this is what controls and orchestrates neural firing patterns in the brain. Another anesthesiologist, Professor Stuart Hameroff of Arizona University and the Center for Consciousness Studies, suggests that in the brain, this array of fractal hexagons in descending scale correlates with conscious experience. Consciousness can move up and down various levels in a fractal-like brain hierarchy, similar to a musical scale. At the frequencies between 40 and 100 Hz, gamma synchrony appears as a pattern of neural oscillation. This increases to 10,000 Hz in microtubules, and even onto megahertz, gigahertz, and even terahertz, each band of frequencies corresponding to ever smaller structures within the brain. Professor Hameroff points out that these are all separated by 3 orders of magnitude, which is the optimal scale for fractal hierarchies to appear with their self-repeating patterns. He compares these octave scales to the lokas of Eastern philosophy, a loka being a Sanskrit word for world in Vedic literature. In the Ageless Wisdom, they're simply called planes of consciousness or planes of existence. One example being that of the dream world. in the sense that it's still you, but that inner experience we call dreaming is not taking place on the physical plane while it's occurring. It is only after we wake up and come back into our physical body that we say, I had a dream. As consciousness is focused in concentrated thinking or meditation, it moves further down the fractal hierarchy of the brain. The frequency of the electromagnetic signals increasing dramatically until they are so rapid that consciousness can be said to be operating independently of physical brain matter, or in one of the subtle worlds or lokas. In other words, as human consciousness evolves into higher states, we will all eventually gain the capacity to become consciously aware of multiple planes of existence simultaneously. Extrasensory perception, like clairvoyance and clairaudience, is only just the beginning of this process. But it is to Dr. Whaling that we return to the actual nature of consciousness, whatever world or loka it may be functioning in. And this brings us back to the concept of perceptual space. Consciousness will never be discovered as a substantial thing with a specific or set location. Even on the highest plane imaginable, for whatever plane life is functioning on, the dynamics of consciousness operate in the perceptual space related to that plane, a dimension apart from all others. It is here that consciousness resides in an indefinable, intangible realm of mathematical relationships. God geometrizes, and consciousness is the result. The esoteric philosophy states that consciousness arises from the interaction between spirit and matter. So whichever of the 7 planes of spirit-infused matter that life is functioning on, the dynamics of consciousness operate in the perceptual space related to that plane, a different kind of space. To the spiritual occultist, there is no such thing as substance, but only force in varying degrees, and only consciousness producing intelligent effect through the medium of space. Thank you for watching. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation. And if you would like to study the original article from which this episode was based, the link will be provided in the video description below. Now, in the next episode of The Electric Bridge, we will explore the secrets of science, alchemy, and psychological transmutation. So be sure to subscribe to Monadic Media for all future updates. And if you're feeling generous, please consider contributing to our Patreon, as it greatly supports our work. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the other side of the Electric Bridge.